Game of Thrones got it wrong. The shocking truth about medieval life: imagine a world of towering castles, fearless knights in shining armor, and endless feasts in candlelit halls. If you've watched Game of Thrones, or almost any medieval-themed show, you probably picture the Middle Ages as a time of dragons, kings, and noble warriors riding into glorious battles. But here is the shocking truth. Most of what Hollywood shows us about medieval life is completely wrong. In fact, the real Middle Ages were stranger, darker, and far more fascinating than fiction. Today, we're re-uncovering the biggest myths about the medieval world, and the truth will change the way you see history forever. When you think of knights, you probably imagine polished suits of armor glistening in the sun, gallant heroes saving damsels in distress. But the reality is that knights were more mercenary than noble. Knighthood wasn't all about honor, it was a job.
How many knights fought
For whoever paid them the most, often switching allegiances between kings and lords. Far from being romantic figures, knights were feared by peasants because their armies brought chaos, destruction, and heavy taxes. And about that shining armor, it wasn't practical for daily use. A full suit of plate armor weighed up to 60 pounds, and most knights didn't wear it unless going into battle or tournaments. So much of the time they wore simple chainmail and padding, far less glamorous than the movies make it seem. Hollywood castles are shown as luxurious palaces filled with tapestries, gold, and roaring fireplaces. In truth, medieval castles were cold, damp fortresses designed for defense, not comfort. Stone walls were drafty, floors were covered in straw, and the smell was unbearable by today's standards. Medieval sanitation was rudimentary at best, and even kings lived in conditions that would feel miserable to us. There were no private bathrooms, heating was scarce, and meals were often eaten in a great hall filled with servants, animals, and noise. Castles were built to withstand sieges, not to impress. They were more like military bases than luxury homes. Here's one myth Hollywood gets completely wrong: the idea that medieval people were filthy, stinking peasants with no teeth. While life was far from hygienic by modern standards, medieval Europeans did care about cleanliness. Bathhouses were common in many towns, and people often washed with basins of water at home. Soap made from animal fat and ash was widely used, and teeth were cleaned with twigs or cloth dipped in salt. In fact, many medieval skeletons show better teeth than those from later centuries, especially the sugar-filled 18th and 19th centuries. So no, not everyone walked around with blackened stumps in their mouths. You might imagine medieval doctors as clueless quacks using leeches for every illness. While some medical practices were strange, medieval medicine wasn't entirely nonsense. Doctors used herbal remedies that are still in use today, like willow bark for pain relief, which contains the same chemical found in aspirin. Monasteries had gardens filled with healing plants, and surgical techniques like setting bones or stitching wounds were surprisingly advanced. However, medical theory was based on balancing the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. That led to bizarre treatments like bloodletting, still given their limited knowledge. Medieval healers did their best, and some methods were more effective than we give them credit for. Hollywood often paints peasants as miserable, starving slaves under cruel kings. While life was hard, peasants weren't completely powerless. Many medieval villagers owned their own homes, had land to farm, and even took part in local courts. They celebrated festivals, weddings, and religious holidays throughout the year, meaning they often worked fewer days annually than a modern office worker. Yes, life expectancy was lower, but that's mostly due to high infant mortality. If someone survived childhood, they had a good chance of living into their 50s or 60s. Medieval movies often show women as helpless princesses locked in towers. But in reality, women held more influence than we think. Noble women managed estates while their husbands were away at war, ran businesses, and even led armies. In some regions, like medieval Spain, women could inherit property and wealth. One famous example is Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was one of the most powerful rulers of her time, controlling lands larger than the King of France. Another myth is that medieval Europe was completely isolated and backward. In truth, medieval cities were bustling trade hubs connected to Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Merchants brought silk, spices, and ideas along trade routes like the Silk Road. Even small towns held vibrant markets, and universities like Oxford and Bologna became centers of learning centuries before the Renaissance. Medieval society was far more connected and cosmopolitan than the Dark Ages stereotype suggests. In some ways, reality was even stranger than fantasy. Medieval festivals included bizarre traditions like the Feast of Fools, where peasants dressed as bishops, and dancing plagues, where people danced uncontrollably for days. Superstitions shaped daily life, with charms, talismans, and astrology guiding decisions. And while dragons never roamed Europe, travelers' tales of exotic animals like elephants and crocodiles added to the mystery of the world. So why does Hollywood get the Middle Ages so wrong? Because fantasy sells. It's the idea of a dark, brutal, and romantic medieval world creates drama. But the truth is more complex. It was a time of progress, trade, and creativity. The Middle Ages gave us universities, Gothic cathedrals, mechanical clocks, and eyeglasses. It was a foundation for much of modern civilization. So next time you watch a medieval fantasy series, remember, reality was just as dramatic, but in a completely different way. The real Middle Ages weren't a world of knights saving princesses and peasants living in misery. They were a world of resilience, innovation, and fascinating complexity. If you enjoyed busting these medieval myths, hit that like button, subscribe for more history deep dives, and tell us in the comments, what's one thing you believed about the Middle Ages that surprised you today? Thanks for listening, and remember, history is always more incredible than fiction.